And here on the Lab to Live stage, we're going to hear around real world lessons and best practical examples. We're very excited to be part of CogX this year. We have 18 stages live, over 30,000 attendees, and we're going to hear some fantastic content today and over the next 3 days from the Lab to Live stage. The theme for CogX this year is how do we get the next 10 years right? And I would encourage you to tweet. The hashtag is hashtag CogX2020. We are all at home, our panelists, our speakers, our guests, and yourself, the audience. So children, family members, and pets are all welcome. And we ask you to embrace the fact that we are at home and enjoying the content that's been put together by the fantastic team at CogX. And today on the Lab to Live stage, we're going to hear some really interesting discussion, content, presentations. We're going to hear about voice and language technologies in healthcare, video production in the cloud, none more so relevant than today, and rapid response customer service during a pandemic. But I'm delighted to introduce our first session today, The Future Consumer, How Retail Changes in the Post-COVID Era. And I'd like to welcome our moderator and first speaker today, Terry von Bibra, Director from Numenos. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. So good morning, everyone. My name is Terry von Bibra. It's a pleasure to be joining you in this excellent event and to kick off the stage. An honor for myself and the panelists. So the future consumer, how retail changes in the post-COVID era is our topic. I'm very cognizant of the theme of our entire event, which is how do we get the next 10 years right? For our panel, that's really then about how does retail get the next 10 years right? And more specifically, how does retail get the next 10 years right for the consumer? Because that is whom this is all about. Very honored and happy to have on the panel with me, Jenny Griffiths. Jenny is the founder of SnapVision. She is a award-winning visual technologist. SnapVision was founded back in 2011 as the first visual search tool for fashion and publishers. And to welcome also Paul Martin, chair of the Global Retail Group and UK head of retail for KPMG. I've worked with Paul and Jenny for years. I'm very happy to do so. Paul is an expert in much of our topic today, omni-channel, how to transform retail, and has worked with many of the world's top brands in helping to do so. Myself, Terry von Bibra, I've worked for Amazon when Amazon was setting up here in Europe, Yahoo, Karstadt, and spent the last 4 years through the end of last year helping to set up Alibaba's business here in Europe. And with that, I'd like to go first to a keynote from myself leading into the topic of the panel on the changing consumer. So I'd like to start with 4 theses. The first one is about technology. And for me, as I look at the situation we're in throughout this topic, throughout the panel, we'll be talking about what the crisis, the COVID crisis, means for the transformation of retail. And in that situation, I see technology continuing to be a powerful enabler. But actually, I believe it will play a smaller role in the transformation than factors such as human psychology, behavioral science, and organizational behavior. And this is due to the fact that functionality and the technology that enables that in any system has always been subservient, is always secondary to the benefit that comes out of that technology. And we're seeing that more than ever in this situation today. The second thesis is the difference between categories will play a smaller role than companies' ability to adapt. There's always been differences in retail across the different categories, both offline and online, and that will continue to be important. But what is going to be more decisive is companies' ability to really adapt successfully in this situation. The third thesis, differences between age groups will play a smaller role than in the old normal. So differences in age groups, typical examples would be younger age groups being more willing and happy to adapt to new technology. Doesn't mean that that changes, but it means that everyone around the world has been forced to try out technology, to try out e-commerce, to try out things like we're doing today with working from home. Everyone has been forced to try these technologies irrespective of their age. And that's why I believe that is going to play a smaller role than it has in a old normal. And the fourth thesis is regional differences. I believe they will continue to play a role. And actually, I believe they may play a larger role going forward because each of us has experienced this crisis very much tied to where we experienced the lockdown. If that's in our home market, that means we've experienced it based on how our local government decided to implement the lockdown. And that has played a very distinctive role because every country has done it slightly differently, with slightly different timing. That means that has played a key role in determining how consumers have engaged with retail during this crisis. So if we first turn to the retail landscape, the retail landscape is currently going through a turbo transformation that frankly will bring about changes by the end of this year that otherwise would have taken up to 5 to 10 years to happen. E-commerce growth is massive. Many retailers are in financially challenging situations. Some very famous global retail brands, iconic brands, are actually in bankruptcy as we speak. That's a very significant part of the retail landscape right now. And the fourth point is there'll be different reactions to the crisis across the different brands. And that has brought out really both the positive and the negative. And consumers are watching this. As I mentioned, e-commerce growth has been massive, but it's not universal. When it comes to things like supermarkets and sporting goods, clearly the demand is very, very high in the e-commerce space. When it comes to categories, though, like fashion and luxury, this has been much more mixed. There was a very significant and frankly healthy debate about whether fashion retailers should continue to sell online. Is fashion an absolutely necessary good like groceries? So on the one hand, people are saying it should stay open because of e-commerce. On the other hand, for a fashion brand, each of those brands had to decide, am I going to put my people, my employees, in a fulfillment center to do e-commerce, exposing them to risks for a product that isn't actually necessary? So that's why there's been a mixed reaction and a good debate about areas like fashion and luxury. Other categories in e-commerce that have not grown in this crisis, travel, airlines, accommodation, live events, they're not down because of anything related to e-commerce. They're down because they're part of that category, which has obviously been hit hard by the crisis. I mentioned regional differences in retail, both based on the local situation going into the crisis and how consumers have experienced it. So this is an important thing also for brands. Many global brands have stores throughout the world, which means as the world has opened up at different timings, they've had the opportunity, let's say in China, which opened up first, brands who have stores in China, European brands, for example, have had the opportunity to see how did that work and use those learnings as they open up elsewhere. How well they're using those learnings, that is the question mark, and that will be an important part of this. If we then turn to the consumer, the consumer is at the heart of all changes in technology and in retail, and it's always technology playing the enabler role. That's not changing here. So it's the changing consumer who's going through this current crisis, who is both the primary reason for the speed of this transformation, but they're also the ones who's ultimately going to determine which of these changes persist into the new normal. And I think this will be an interesting topic of our panel discussion today, and I think something interesting for everyone watching to think about. Of the changes happening right now in retail, how many of those changes do you believe will actually remain and continue as the COVID crisis recedes? No one knows the answer to that question. I certainly don't, but I think it's going to be a very interesting thing to see between new adapted behavior versus human habits, and which of those win out when it comes to these new behaviors. Second point is the consumer. We're seeing things on this page. We've got some interesting results from a recent McKinsey survey. One of those things is just the growth of low contact commerce, buying online, picking up in store. That's grown all over the world, 30 to 56% in the crisis. Interestingly, everywhere except China. China's only grown by 1%. That doesn't mean low contact commerce is not important in China. It simply means that in China, it was already normal coming into the crisis. If we look, though, at China and the other market, consumers intend to continue to want to use things like low-content commerce. That is very high everywhere, 48 to 73%. Similar on in-store self-checkout, 10 to 16% growth around the world. But consumers are saying, I want that functionality. I want that ability to check out without having to have too much close physical contact, 65 to 92%. A third interesting insight, time to adjust your routines given the current situation. So this is about how long do consumers believe it's going to take them to adjust their behavior, their shopping behavior to the new normal. And that was universal, 88 to 98% across all sorts of countries around the world. Consumers saying it will take 2 months or longer. And in fact, in many of those markets, the change was saying up to 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months. So this is a long-term transition. The fourth point here on trial, consumers are indicating, consumers right now are trying lots of new brands. So think about it. If you normally shop at your neighborhood store, and now you're looking for a way to shop online, your neighborhood store might not have the best online offer. It might be a store you've never used. That's driving a lot of consumers to try out new brands they otherwise would not have. Again, the key question here is, how many of those consumers will continue to use those new brands or go back to their old solutions? They're indicating they plan to stick with the new brands, but that's really a question to be seen. So I wanted to do a poll question. I'm actually not sure whether the technology is working for that, so I'm going to pause on that point until after my keynote, and we'll come back to it if it is possible to do. So going on to companies and brands. So frankly, in my opinion, many companies and brands will either not survive this upheaval or will come out of it weaker, based on how they go through the transition and how they came into it. Retailers have been painfully aware of the need to transform for years. The vast majority of investment in omnichannel, for example, has come primarily from offline retailers, not because they were faster movers than online retailers, it's because they already had a major problem where we're looking for online and omnichannel to help them with that. So for me, I think one of the most interesting questions is, people for me and others who've been working in this industry and pushing for omnichannel for many, many years, why has it taken a crisis of this scale, a crisis of a generation, in order to provide the necessary impetus for true retail transformation? The companies who come out of this stronger will be those who first manage and then embrace these changes and do so in a way that brings the stronger purpose to their employees' work and a stronger delivery of their value proposition to their consumers. That is key to their coming out stronger and surviving this transition. Omnichannel, something that many of us have been really working on for years and pushing for, trying to create that seamless experience. But the existential risk to many offline stores is they now need to integrate online and offline. It's even more critical. One possible benefit here is it's put them in a situation where it's no longer a nice to do. Omnichannel and online is not a nice to have for retailers. Overnight, it has become an existential necessity. So that is really pushing the omnichannel push. I wish it could have happened without that, but it's absolutely helping to drive it. So that leads us to questions about things like, what is the role of the store? What is the role of the physical store? Many stores are being closed. People are talking about how much retail space is really needed in the future of retail. People are talking about that could be up to a 30% reduction or more in the physical square meters being used by retail. What does that mean for department stores, shopping malls who were already challenged pre-crisis and use a lot of physical space as part of retail and less online, frankly? This might provide some of those companies with the impetus to say, I want to do something the way a startup would. This has been a key factor in much of omnichannel. Startups start with a blank sheet of paper and say, I have an idea, I have a target customer, they have wants and needs that I want to address. What do I need to do that? So they don't start with a whole bunch of physical store property. They start with an idea and they say, do I need physical stores to help me do that? If so, what role does the physical store play versus my online channel? How much space do I need in the physical store to fulfill my value proposition. That's a great way to start a business plan. That's how startups work. But for most retailers, they simply haven't had the luxury of doing it that way because they have the space and they've had to try to make use of it. This may provide the opportunity to start fresh. Partnerships is another point that I believe will be very important for companies in this transition. A key way to do partnerships is in marketplaces. Marketplaces is one of the fastest growing areas in retail here in Europe and America. And China, marketplaces already is by far the dominant form of online. But marketplaces are a great way for brands to work together and to work with others to try to strengthen their value proposition. Partnerships is another way to improve convenience. When I think of omnichannel, I always think of 4 pillars. That's selection, convenience, price, and experience. Partnerships is a great way to strengthen the convenience part of that proposition. So when it comes to companies, I think it's really important. What are they doing for their people in the crisis? How are they supporting their people? Training, onboarding, workforce composition and flexibility. Think about onboarding. For most of us, we've worked in a company for years and now we've had to work from home. That's not easy, but you already know your colleagues. You've already built a relationship with it. But think about people who are having to onboard to a new job in this situation. How much harder that is. They don't have that relationship. So companies trying to figure out how to do that well, it's very, very important, and the good companies are doing so. Agility is another thing. You know, I think one of the positive things that have come out of this very difficult situation is agility, the agility that many companies have discovered in their own workforces. So I've read over and over again about companies, you know, who said, look, we had to launch an online offering within 3 weeks. That would have normally taken 6 months to 9 months. My team turned around and did it in 3 weeks, did it in days. That agility, that energy, that focus was always there in their team. The crisis has brought it forward. So companies were able to take that motivation and that focus and continue to use that agility coming out of the crisis and beyond the crisis. These will be the winning companies. The importance of values. All companies have values. All companies have mission statements. But consumers and employees have spent the last weeks really looking at their company's values and said, is that really a purpose-driven value? And do we live by it? Are the values credible? Are the values held with sincerity in the company? Brands who focus on customer experience, on their value proposition, have shown a much stronger resilience in the past, in past crises. Coming out of the 2008 crisis, Forrester showed in research that companies who were focused on the customer experience over everything else had a 3x better performance coming out of the crisis. I believe that will be similar coming out of this crisis. So really using a brand's unique value proposition for their target customers as the guiding principle to decide what to do in this crisis, this is really, I think, the key thing for companies to be mindful of. So coming to a close, in summary, we are jumping forward 5 to 10 years in the retail experience. Coming back to my theses, functionality and the technology that enables it is in all systems always secondary to the benefit. And that is what we're seeing in this transition and in this transformation. Differences between categories and between age groups will play a smaller role in the retail transformation, while regional differences may actually play an even larger role. And of the new consumer behaviors and preferences, only some will continue post-COVID. Which ones and to which degree will be determined more by human nature and the power of our habits as humans than by traditional modes of retail operations. So with that, thank you for your attention. I'd now like to turn to the panel part of our discussion. I'd ask Gillian to bring in both of our other panelists. So, Paul and Jenny, I hope you could hear everything okay, as well as everyone else. And my first question to both of you would be, and I'll start with Jenny, your thoughts on the discussion I just put forth in my keynote and the theses in there about the transformation of retail going into and coming out of the COVID crisis.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. It was really enlightening, and I was quite pleased my camera wasn't on because I was doing the whole kind of nodding along when you were making certain points. So I've been in the visual search industry for about a decade, believe it or not, at this point. So this theme means quite a lot to me. And one of my big passions over that kind of past 10 years is this whole online and offline commerce should be going hand in hand. So I once went into a retailer and I was told I was the devil, quote, because I was trying to kill offline retailing. And I was kind of going, no, digital commerce should go hand in hand with this kind of more physical commerce. And I think that this is a really good opportunity to prove that technology shouldn't be there for innovation's sake. It shouldn't be there for kind of fancy new widgets. It should really be leveraged by brands to help them drive better brand experiences for their customers. So I think this is a really interesting point. Like you said, things have accelerated hugely, and now's the time to kind of prove that real value in technology. I think that there are a few kind of key areas that stick out from an innovation point of view. So one of them is around helping people deal with not being able to try on clothes. So giving people the opportunity to shop by shape rather than shop by trend, because you know what works for your body shape, it minimizes returns. So being a bit more intelligent with the way that you're letting people discover brands in the real world and on your online platform, because returns is going to be a huge inconvenience just from a practical point of view as a consumer. You don't want to go back to a shop necessarily to go and drop it off, and you really don't want to go to the post office. I'm looking outside at the queue as I speak. So I think returns is going to become front of mind for retailers and consumers. I think less face-to-face contact for advice, obviously, especially in the fashion industry. This is a kind of huge part of a retail experience, and seeing brands, especially luxury brands, become more creative with that will be quite interesting. Whether it's opportunities for kind of video conferencing like now, talking through your wardrobe. I think there might be a few kind of luxury ways of moving that kind of retail experience on and minimizing that face-to-face contact in a retail environment, which as an introvert, I'm also very much for. I think contactless payments might become a really interesting field. Obviously, it's had a huge impact in COVID already. But whether we can actually take that one step further. So do we need to be using PIN pads? Could we be doing things with geofencing? Even really simple things about where are you going to put contactless payment points? Do you want to be driving people to the back of the store as you traditionally have to make sure they've seen all the products? Or do you want to make it a kind of fast in and out? And if you are taking that approach from safety, how do you still encourage discoverability on the other side? So I think that's going to be a huge debate for retailers. And then finally, I think considering, and this is a rather bleak point, but if we have to kind of keep sliding in and out of this kind of new normal and the way that we used to run. So for instance, if there's a second wave, if winter makes things, there's so many things we don't know about the virus. It's how can retailers begin to protect themselves against this happening again? So do they want to be actively using online as a channel and having more experiential things in store? Do they want to make it easier to manage inventory between in-store and online? So doing things like automated tagging, using AI. So I think as kind of things go on, it will be this initial peak of how can we make our brand operate efficiently now? And then hopefully in the back of retailers' minds, it will be this kind of future-proofing, trying to stop this from happening again. And I think the brands that will really win long-term will be looking in that direction.
Thank you, Jenny. A lot of important points there. There's so many different opportunities here. So, Paul, your thoughts?
Thank you, Terry. And look, unsurprisingly, a lot of the thoughts you outlined in your presentation resonate with my thinking. You and I have debated the transformation of retail over the last couple of years many, many times. And it is fair to say, and I'm being slightly flippant here, but up until about 10 years ago, retail hadn't really changed for 2,000 years. If you had the opportunity to build a time machine and to go back to ancient Rome or ancient Athens, you would have broadly seen a very, very similar structure to retail. Yes, of course, curtains have been replaced by glass windows. Drawers where money was put in have been replaced by electronic cash registrars. But overall, retail had been broadly the same for a long time until about 10 or 15 years ago, online really became a mainstream channel. And that has significantly changed the structure of retail. And the current health pandemic we are experiencing around the world, COVID-19 is absolutely accelerating that transformation of the retail sector. And I would argue some of the trends that we have been speaking about for a number of years are now going to happen much, much quicker. A group of chief executives I was speaking with just last week said, we thought we would have 3 to 5 years to make these changes. We're going to have to make them much, much faster now. And if we don't, there is the real risk that many of the brands, as you highlighted very correctly in your presentation, will just not survive. And I believe we really need to focus on 4 key trends. There are 4 key themes that retailers really need to have front of mind at this point in time. And a number of these you already referenced, but let me just mention them again in a summary. The first is business model and partnerships. The retail business that for thousands of years has historically been focused on physical stores is changing, and more transactions are happening in the online channel. So therefore, focusing on an omni or a multi-channel approach. I know these words probably invented by consultants like myself. These are not words that resonate with everybody, but the key aspect here, single unified approach to all customer touch points. So channel agnostic, customer centric, that is where business models need to move. And in that context, many retail businesses are going to struggle to transform with the capital and the capabilities they have. So therefore, they're going to have to think about partnerships. In some cases, they may even need to think about, in inverted commas, dancing with the devil. How can you work with businesses that were maybe perceived as competitors today or yesterday to help you transform going forward? Partnerships are going to be really critical. The second key point I'd like to outline is cost of doing business. I mentioned it's going to be very, very difficult for many of the legacy businesses to transform their business models going forward. Many chief executives are telling me they are going to have to take 20 to 50% of their cost base out of their businesses over the next 12 to 18 months. We know retail has always been a low margin sector, and if these changes are not undertaken, retail will not be able to survive with the old ways of working. Specifically looking at cost of goods, looking at real estate, which assets do I need? Looking at the workforce, which parts of the processes can be automated or I can use technology to make my workforce more efficient? And finally, technology and supply chain. And Jenny already referenced a whole host of different technological advancements that retailers really need to adapt going forward. The third area I would highlight is the customer. And the title of this session is all about how is the customer going to drive changes in consumer commerce going forward. And I would argue it has never been as important today to understand who she or he is, you as a retailer are interacting with. For decades, if not centuries, it was all about great products and great location. You still need great products and great locations in retail, but now you really need to understand the customer. That is the differentiator. And if you don't, you will fail going forward. And the fourth point, closely interlinked with the customer, is purpose and sustainability. And Terry, you referenced that in your keynote. Consumers want to know that the brands, the retailers they are interacting with share similar values to them. And we will see specifically in the COVID context, there will be a day of reckoning. Have retailers behaved in the right way? Have they supported their staff, consumers, the local communities? And if they haven't, consumers increasingly will vote with their feet and will not interact with these organizations anymore.
Got it. Thanks, Paul. Those were great points, and I really think helps to sort of bring it together, this idea of, and that's the whole idea of the live to lab stage, which is trying to help retailers figure out and give them some input about what they can do in this transformation. Those are really, really helpful points. So we'd like to do a poll We're going to see if the technology is working, and if it is, that's great. If not, we'll move on. But I wanted to do one poll because we're just really curious to hear from the audience, listening to this discussion and your own experience in the crisis. What do you believe of all these behavioral changes in retail that consumers are showing? So your own personal experience, those around you, and what you're seeing in your own home market of these changes, how much of those as a percentage do you believe actually will continue to go on after the crisis? So if people are shopping more online, grocery shopping has gone up maybe twice as much online. Will that continue afterwards, or will it change? If people want low touch commerce, will that continue to the same degree? Love to hear your views. So if I could ask our tech team to put the poll live, and for people to be able to go in and give your choice, 20%, 40, 60, 80, or 100%. Will all of these changes remain, or will it be very, very little? That is the question. So let me pause there to see if we can get the technology working. I think what we might do while we're waiting for that technology is, Jenny, let me ask you another question, and we can always interrupt if the poll shows up. We'll just pause there. Yeah. So Jenny, retailtainment has been a big subject before the crisis. Retail not just as being something to fulfill the needs, but also the wants, or even as part of entertainment. That's a big part of how retail works in China today, for example. Do you believe that a lot of the technology, be it visual search or other types of technology, as the physical space required for retail, the physical space retail may play in the future goes down, can these technologies help to bring in that retailtainment factor, not just online, but also offline, across an omni-channel experience? What is your view on that?
Yeah, I think it should, and I think we're going to see a huge acceleration in that direction. One of my kind of main theses driving me on a day-to-day basis is, can you make an offline experience as entertaining and as fulfilling as an offline experience? From how easy is it to discover products, to how social is it, to kind of can you get that instant buzz from buying something that you sometimes get in a kind of shopping mall environment? So I think that there will be considerations to drive this kind of being more mindful about the customer experience that you're creating when you're creating an online shopping experience. So it sounds like a really glib example, but the way that a £5,000 handbag's sold online could be exactly the same way that you're selling a tube of toothpaste. There's not really this kind of differentiated experience at the moment in the online world. So I think there are a number of ways that people can do that. In a visual search and an AI context, this kind of bit around product discoverability, and to be honest, kind of introducing this serendipity back into online search. So you don't want to be constantly pushed. People like you also bought this, because that's the worst thing you could possibly do in a fashion environment. You want to be unique, you want to stand out. So giving people the tools to be able to kind of emulate what they love about real world shopping and bring that into online. I think as well, just being a bit more sensitive around the impact that online has on in-store and how you can make them work a bit more hand in hand. We did a project with Westfield, believe it or not, in 2012, around can you use online planning systems. So we use visual search to let you kind of virtually browse Westfield and bring shopping lists into store. I think seeing that kind of collaboration between the kind of two, they're normally separate business units, to be honest, within retailers, seeing that collaboration going, innovating together, I think that's how we're going to drive innovation in that direction.
Got it. Well, I know everyone's going to be looking for any kind of help they can get, both on the technology side, and it's great when that technology can be used seamlessly, both online and offline. So Paul, one question I think that a lot of retailers are thinking about right now is, they've scaled back their workforce out of necessity during the crisis, with different degrees of support from the government and tapping into their own liquidity. And now that shops are opening up in many countries, they're looking to bring people back in. But they don't know how quickly consumers will feel comfortable doing so in each of the different markets, which gives retailers sort of a double whammy. They might ramp up costs again in anticipation, while consumers don't yet come back, and that could be, just really hit them in a double whammy way. How are you advising your clients when it comes to this sort of very difficult situation and decision?
Yeah, it's a great question, Terry. And look, in my role leading KPMG's global retail practice, I speak to a lot of retail leaders around the world on a daily basis. And of course, I've been very privileged to speak to some of my colleagues and also clients in markets like China, like South Korea, who are further evolved down the evolution of the current situation. And we have classified the COVID pandemic in 4 different stages. The first stage was the react phase. Lockdown scenarios were imposed. How do you react to that situation? If you're an essential retailer, do you guarantee the availability through your supply chain and you keep your colleagues and your customers safe? If you're a non-essential retailer and had to close your stores, how do you preserve cash and impose liquidity measures? How do you address the challenges around your workforce and access various government funding schemes, which of course have been brought into fruition in various different markets with sort of slightly different mechanics. You then move into the resilience phase, which many retailers are now coming to the end of that resilience phase. And then you move into recovery, which is the phase you're just referring to, and then the new reality. This is not a sequential approach, though. Whilst in the resilience phase, you absolutely need to be thinking about the recovery and the new reality phase. And what you will be seeing, and I am based in London in the UK, non-essential retail will open as of next Monday, and we will see only a limited number of stores reopening. And you would have seen this in other countries too. Not every single non-essential store will reopen on day one. In some cases, and my prediction is about 25% of those non-essential stores will actually never reopen again. Retailers are being very, very cautious about the demands, and this is the million-dollar question many retail leaders are asking me. Well, what will demand look like once we reopen? And the reality at this point in time is it is suppressed. Even if we look at China, Hong Kong, speaking to my colleagues in Hong Kong last week, depending on different categories, demand is between 10 and 30% down. And we're also seeing this in Italy, in Germany, in Austria. Demand, people are nervous of queuing, people are nervous of going into areas with large human congregations. So therefore, we are seeing a reduction in footfall. But at the same time, what is very interesting is that conversion rates have significantly increased. If I queue to enter a physical store, then I will do that for a specific mission. Browsing is something which was a large part in non-essential categories. That is going to be put aside, I would argue, for the short to mid-term, definitely the next 12 months. So therefore, conversion rates are up. And again, there are no definitive data sets on this yet, as we are still in a very fluid situation. But we are seeing a whole host of retailers getting back to about 90% of their sales in 4 to 8 weeks after the lockdown measures are relaxed. But if you go back to the point I mentioned earlier regarding cost of doing business, even 90% of your sales, if that is the longer term future outlook, would be very detrimental for the retail sector. If I give you the stats on UK retailing, in 2010, median profitability of UK retail stood at 6%. It declined to 4.5% in 2013, to 2.5% in 2019. And if I look at our forecasts, it will decline to 0.5% in 2020. And that means there's not a lot of headroom for retailers to operate at. And even those businesses in the essential category that have seen a significant surge in demand have also seen a significant increase in their costs. It's not translating to the bottom line. So retailers are going to have to manage costs in a very, very, very focused way over the next months. Otherwise, sadly, we will see an even longer list of retail casualties going forward.
Wow, well, that's very sobering, but I believe very wise advice, Paul. This is just the situation we're in, and people need to know to be able to plan for that. So, Jenny, you know, a lot of retailers are hearing right now the importance of empathy, importance for their employees, important for their customers, and you know, being reachable, caring, showing that empathy. You know, one of the examples here in Germany, where I'm based, it was very interesting on that front was actually McDonald's and Aldi getting together as the crisis kicked off, and McDonald's saying, "Look, we've got excess employees because we're shut down. Aldi, you've got huge demand. Can our employees help you out to serve that demand?" And they did that, and it was a really good example of two very huge brands getting together to do something good for the consumers, for their businesses, in a way that otherwise might not have been possible. But when it comes to brands caring, being reachable for their brands, it seems to me like that's something that always is good and always makes sense. So my question to you is, does this mean that when the COVID crisis is over, it's okay to be uncaring, unreachable, non-empathetic, or how does that play out?
Yeah, I really hope not. I think there was a big movement in retail in the last probably 2 to 3 years where messaging around empathy and brand values was on the increase, mainly from an environmental standpoint. So brands like Patagonia really seeing their kind of brand equity increase over time, given that kind of messaging. I think that is just going to accelerate given this kind of current crisis that we're going through. But I think that what consumers are becoming more mindful of is that the messaging has to match what they're actually doing and their actions. I think that some brands have handled this incredibly well. Anecdotally, I was having a conversation with one of my friends who said, well, I don't normally shop in Next, but actually I've seen the way that they've been treating their employees, the way that they even shut down their website to not put them in risk and fulfillment centers. So I want to shop there more. And they're the kind of conversations that I've been having with my friends, just kind of generally around retail, is that people are really putting people's actions above what they're saying. A kind of more negative example would be someone like Sports Direct, who tried to stay open, and obviously there was that huge backlash on Twitter. So I like to think that consumers across all generations are becoming more mindful around how people are acting and how the kind of ethics of a company are impacting how you should be interacting with them. And it's not just this kind of niche consumer who cares about the environment. It's something that will just become a part of mainstream retail. And to be honest, it doesn't cost retailers a lot more to be able to act ethically. So hopefully they'll see that they're looking at it from a very cold return on investment angle. I think that it's a really important message that they should be getting out there.
Thank you, Jenny. I hope so too. I hope that what things people have learned about what are basic good human ways of interacting will continue also after the crisis. Let's be optimistic and hope so. So we've got just about 1 more minute. Paul, last question for you, and I'll keep it short because this is a tricky one, but I'd love you to get a quick answer. Groceries, right? So the grocery category has grown so fast in this crisis, and yet most grocery online services fulfill from their physical stores, which are really not suitable as fulfillment centers. They're suitable for customers, not for fulfillment. So on the one hand, it's growing. On the other hand, the way it's set up is not actually set up to scale. What is your view on how grocery is going to come out of this? Are they going to be able to manage that growth? Are they going to be able to retool quickly enough to manage this growth? How is grocery going to come out of this huge demand they're currently experiencing?
Well, as I just highlighted, Terry, I mean, grocery has absolutely seen a significant increase in demand as the dine away from home sector has been completely shut down in many markets. And there are still a lot of debate when will hospitality and leisure venues be able to fully reopen. In various markets, we have seen outside spaces reopen, but that consumption has all shifted to the in-home consumption pattern, and supermarkets benefit from that. But at the same time, we've also seen grocery online really surge, and that has been at a much lower level from a penetration perspective than non-food online. And the reason for that is it's not been very easy to generate a profitable business model in this context. And I do think a reorganized business model is going to have to be invented. We're still very, very undercooked from a click and collect perspective. If I look to France, click and drive is a well-established model. It is a much more profitable business model than the grocery home delivery model. In the UK, grocery online stood at about 7% penetration. During the crisis, it has nearly doubled from a penetration perspective. But most retailers are not interested in this expanding too much further, as they don't make any money through home deliveries. But if I look at China, there has been some really, and China's probably 10 years ahead of us in this context. Stores are being used for home deliveries, but there's a very different use of technology of making that more efficient and, most importantly, profitable. So in many of the other mature markets, like continental Europe, like the United States or Canada, that business model is going to have to be reinvented. And I do think COVID will be a real accelerator of that, as we've seen a clear demand for home delivery, but retailers have to do that in a profitable way.
Got it. Well, thanks, Paul. So we're going to come to a close now. So I really want to thank Ginny Griffiths, Paul Martin, for this very interesting and I think very important discussion about the transformation of retail and how we can come out of it stronger. We're going to close now. We're going to have a Q&A for those participants who have access to the Q&A in about 13 minutes. So please participate there. And otherwise, thank you, everyone, and wishing everyone a great CogX event for the next 3 days. Thank you.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.